Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. As always, this episode of Lateral Think is brought to you with the support of Strength by Numbers. Strength by Numbers have created an integrated clinical and sports performance system. The AXIT system uses force platforms, dynamometry and strain gauges to objectively measure everything from isolated movements to sports performance tasks. The system has greatly enhanced our clinical practice, decision making and objectivity. We are no longer guessing. The greatest thing is its ease of use, both for practitioners and clients. There are no wires, no fixed setup. It is a fully integrated Bluetooth system. If this sounds like something that would enhance your practice, visit strengthbynumbers.com and tell them that Melbourne Athletic Development sent you. Today, we are extremely lucky to have a close colleague of ours, researcher Adam Bryant from Melbourne University. You've been there for a long time, Adam.
About 17 or 18 years now.
Tell us what you do, mate.
So I'm loosely defined, I suppose, as a biomechanist. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades.
That's a very loose term for the research that you've done.
It is. I'm a bit of a jack of all trades and probably master of none these days. But
do you think that's to your advantage?
To some extent, to some extent, but in other respects not. Yeah, but I'm in Chesham, so the Centre for Health, Exercise and Sports Medicine, which is headed up by Professor Kim Burnell, and Rana Hinman's the second in charge there, so it's got an amazing leadership team there. And I'm the head of the sports medicine stream, I suppose you'd say.
Okay. What does that mean? What kind of research are you doing?
Well, again, sports medicine is such a loose term, isn't it? So we mainly look at younger people. So if you think about the continuum in terms of, say, for example, joint health across the lifespan, Kim and Rana and many of the other team look at more of the sort of OA-related cohorts. Our research is mainly focusing on the younger cohorts and prevention, but we've also done quite a bit of work on ACL reconstruction as well.
I think that's, Jack and I both came across you as undergraduate students through the physio course at Melbourne, and we were very quickly attracted to the way in which you constructed a lot of your research, and it opened up a lot of conversations that, now that 10, 12 years later, we're still in contact with you pretty regularly. And I think the first time that I heard you speak for our cohort, I was really enamored by the view that you were taking on something like ACL research, which is actually looking at, say, hormone influence on collagen structures. To me, at the time, I remember thinking, okay, well, this is a lot more holistic in terms of what you're doing. Yep. And we can talk about the hormone effects, because I think that would be something you do. But the first question I kind of wanted to pose to you is, have you always thought that way, a bit more holistic and a little bit less of that direct cause-effect sort of mechanism?
Yeah, I suppose I've always sort of thought of myself as a creative thinker, so to sort of run with those key concepts. It's a good question, actually. Holistically, and as I sort of said at the outset, I'm a jack of all trades, probably a master of none, so I like to be across a lot of things, so whether that means I'm holistic or not.
Well, you definitely are. Like, having known you for a while, you tend to have very good understanding across lots of different areas of not only research, but actually just exploration of sports medicine particularly. Yeah,
I think my problem, or my... I don't know if it's a problem, but I get bored pretty quickly. So to research in the same space for decades probably drive me a bit crazy. So I'm always jumping around from topic to topic.
It's interesting you say that. We had Tanya Pizzari on only a few weeks back, and it's something that we put forward to her as well, because she's done research in lots of different areas.
Tanya's done some really good work.
And we said that to her, and she sort of said, well, I think it's because I'm a clinician. I don't want to just know about shoulders, or I just don't want to know about, say, obviously she did a fair bit of work with another colleague of ours, Brady Green, on calf injury stuff that he put together for his PhD. And she sort of said, well, as a clinician, you can't have this mindset, I only do this.
It was interesting too to hear her thoughts about research, because she actually has some very interesting research ideas, but the limitation is just on the funding and resources to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's a big problem, Jack. Well, it's not a problem for some people. Some people
get lots of funding.
Are well and truly cashed up. For example, Kim and Rana have incredible amount of funding. They're extraordinarily successful. For the rest of us, it is a struggle. So you're always looking for grant funding, whether that be sort of via sort of industrial links. So that's pretty much what we've done, is mainly look at industry. So partnering with industry, our biggest supporter is ASICS, and so there's an Australian research program called the Linkage Initiative. So basically, you can go into partnership with a large industry. They put in some money and they put in some in-kind funding, and we apply for equivalent funding or more, obviously more than what they contribute to do our research.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of that?
So the advantages of it are that the success rates are very high. Comparatively high, around
in terms of getting funding, you say?
Yeah, it's around about 30%.
That seems high.
Don't quote me too much on that. But when you think about some of the NHMRC initiatives at the moment, you're looking at well under 10%.
Okay,
and
so
some
that
of them
difficult.
around 5%.
Yeah.
So you're looking at 9.5 applications out of 10 are unsuccessful.
Yeah.
And it's extremely competitive. So. We've just got some funding in the MRFF, Medical Research Future Fund. So Cade Patterson led a project in that, looking at footwear for anterior knee pain in girls. And I'm also part of another NHMRC grant at the moment, looking at sort of knee joint health across the lifespan with David Lloyd's group in Griffith University. But my focus in recent years has really been on that industrial support and collaborative grants. So we're getting ready to submit another ARC linkage with ASICS, but this time looking at footy boots for women. So,
what's the downside of that?
So the downside of it is that
do you get more directed in what you can look at?
Yeah, you have an obligation to your industry partner, obviously. ASICS have been fantastic to us, so they've given us a long lead, so to speak. But you do have an obligation to fulfil. And in that respect, you are, I guess, not limited, but you are, what's the right word? You're not obliged. It's, there are some restraints, I suppose, in terms of where you can go with things. So, for example, our research has been on netball shoes, but part of that we've been able to explore the effects of female puberty on knee biomechanics. So there's always a chance to sort of diversify and do different things, but at the end of the day, the grant was around a netball shoe. So you're bound to basically test or focus on ASIC's product because they're the sponsor, obviously, so they want to get something out of it, which is completely and absolutely fine. But, I guess one of the criticisms of our research is that, you've looked at ASIC's shoes, why haven't you looked at Adidas or Nike or some of these other products? And it's like, well, we have an obligation to our industry partner, and, looking at other shoes is really outside the scope of the project.
Do you think that's something that stifles innovation within our profession because of the fact that there are quite large constraints about how much funding there is and where it comes from?
It's a really good question, Jack. It's a really good question. I mean, the research, I suppose you'd start with the fact that as I was saying before, the research, applying for research grants and winning research grants is extremely difficult now, and it's changed over the last 5 to 10 years. It's getting harder and harder. So I sit on the NHMRC review panels and the ARC review panels, and some of the applications are just phenomenal.
So it's not an issue with a shortage of good ideas.
It's fantastic ideas. But you really need to be part of a large research team that's collaborating together. You can't really be out on your own or with a particularly small group. So again, if we come back to Kim and Rana's program of research, they're extraordinarily successful because they work together and they have a really strong research group around them, and they have international and national collaborators. So it makes for an extremely strong research team. So getting the research money is actually quite hard. So there is an NHMRC ideas grant initiative now. So that allows a little bit more sort of creative thinking. So there's a little bit more laxity in terms of what you can do, and I do think it sort of fosters more of that creative ideas focus where it fosters sort of more creative thinking and more creative work within the project. So I think that's been a great initiative. But in terms of the quality of applications, it's just phenomenal. Some of the stuff that you read, it's just incredible. And it's next generation stuff. We're talking a lot about AI and neural networks and that kind of thing. So we're talking big data. Gone are the days where you're going to test 50 to 100 people in some of these applications, and it's more about data mining and lots and lots of participants.
It's interesting because we mentioned that we recently just spoken with Avish, the VIS physiologist, and we spoke a little bit about data and how in the world of getting results that can be a real problem in the sense that people are measuring a lot.
Yep.
A lot of time needs to go into interpreting that, and then the data that you collect, particularly interestingly, sometimes in, say, performance settings, and I think it's the same in terms of injury management, the data that you collect isn't necessarily always as useful as, say, even subjective measures,
Exactly.
which kind of, I think, throws a spanner in the works when you think about these ideas of these really big, data mining projects or these big data projects. You think, okay, well, they're going to be able to answer complex problems, but sometimes I think they almost create more clouds in the water.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is.
How do you mean clouds in the water? What do you...
Well, one of the things that I think is always very obvious when you think of any sort of we talk a lot about complex systems and about the fact that the thing that you're measuring at the end of the day is the emergent pattern or the emergent behaviour.
Yeah. Yep.
That's the signal.
Yep.
What actually happens inside that complex system and the interactions that occur are very hard to measure.
Yeah, definitely.
If you build a model of data, often the hard thing that they're trying to do is work out what are those interactions and how do they work. And the thing that I find the difficult part is unless you have a really strong understanding of which things need to be measured, the only source that's actually valuable is the signal that comes out, not necessarily all that information that you've gathered through the lots and lots of data points.
It's like that saying, what is it?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Not everything that can be counted counts. Not everything that counts can be counted.
Or measured.
Yeah, look, it's a...
Well, more importantly, because when you start collecting lots and lots of data, particularly in the real world, what do you actually do with it? Because you're not going to be collecting dozens of different data points and going, okay, well, I'm going to address all these factors because that's just not feasible. So I think that's where the challenge lies. But I think that's something that, again, I know that John mentioned before of are there particular principles that we can take from some research that helps us to make decisions clinically just based on subjective information as opposed to thinking about always collecting data itself? I think of, for example, some of your research findings with looking at hormonal factors related to the connective tissue biomechanics. Because I think it'd be interesting to talk about that and thinking about what that means in regards to injury and particularly throughout the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, it's good. It's a nice lead in. So I guess let me start by saying, look, I'm really interested in the acute effects of estrogen, and looking back, because I did these 2 talks at Sports Medicine Australia conference last week, and one of them was about pubertal maturation and injury. Not so much injury, more about the biomechanical contributors to injury, because we know that girls from 5 to 14 and then from 14 upwards into their early 20s, they're the ones that have the highest rates of knee and lower limb injuries. So looking back at it, it was a bit sort of disappointing that I hadn't pursued that more, because it was really...
Your original research was from quite some time ago, wasn't it?
Early 2000s,
I think that was 2008. I think we published those papers, but they were looking at the effects of fluctuating estrogen across the 28-day menstrual cycle, and we also included a monophasic oral contraceptive pill group in that. So effectively that attenuates your estrogen levels substantially.
And what effect does that actually have on the connective tissue structures?
So what we found was that the high and the low estrogen had an effect on tissue mechanics. So we found that the tissues became more and less compliant across the menstrual cycle. But what we found was the pill because it attenuated those estrogen levels, it attenuated also those changes in mechanics. So the tissues became more consistent, I suppose you'd say, across that 28-day cycle. So the argument is that if the tissue mechanics are more consistent, then I guess the neuromuscular system doesn't have to adapt from week to week, and potentially that might actually affect, tissue loads. And
is that a good or a bad thing?
Well,
because adaptation is usually the goal, and you want more variability in your biomechanical pursuit.
Very good question. Very good statement, John. Thanks for that. I suppose adaptation's good. I mean, maybe from sort of week to week, it's not such a good thing. I don't know, because it presents a very fluctuating demand on that neuromuscular system to.
But isn't that what you encounter in, say, elite change of direction type sports? Is in a consistent fluctuation?
Yeah, I suppose what you're talking about there is external variations in terms of, loads or demands, but then you've got the internal considerations as well. So it's hard to answer the question in terms of, whether internal fluctuations in hormonal levels and those changes in soft tissue mechanics and even neuromuscular activation, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess you can go and you could look at the injury data, and the injury data is a little bit all over the place as well.
What does it show currently?
So, there's some papers that argue that the ovulatory phase has the highest rates of injury. So there was a study in the United States which kind of was hypothesis generating, I suppose you'd say. It was one of the first in this area.
What year was that?
It was in the early 2000s, I think.
Is that something that kind of stimulated you guys to
look
at
it?
Because
it did.
Before you mentioned that stuff, I hadn't seen much of it. And then there's been a lot of it over this maybe 5 or 6 years, particularly post the AFLW starting in Australia. Yeah. And I was kind of laughing. I mean, like, Adam did this stuff 10 years ago. Like, why are you guys pretending like you invented this area of research?
Yeah, look, thanks for the kind words again, John. But that's why, as I said, I was really, in sort of reviewing our literature and putting the talks together, I was, and I included some of our early work, and I just thought, why didn't I do more in that space? Whether it was a funding issue or, again, like I said, I get sort of bored pretty quickly. But it was a real lost opportunity, actually, because now
it's become big.
Now everyone's onto it. So
I was actually, on that topic, is there any research looking at changes in physical performance through the menstrual cycle?
Yeah, there's quite a lot.
Because what's the correlation there with regards to performance and the menstrual cycle?
Good question, Jack. I'm not really up on the performance side of it. I'm more sort of interested in the biomechanics and the isolated tissue mechanics.
I think, it's interesting because I get asked this question a lot, and I've coached a number of reasonably elite female athletes, and the question that I have been asked is, are you, say, tracking their menstrual cycle?
Yep.
And I say to people, we track their menstrual cycle to make sure they're healthy, because it's a really good indication of how they're tolerating their training and their general health.
Yep.
But I'm not asking them to measure phases. And one of the reasons I don't do that is I think it psychologically puts you in a state where you think that there's an effect, whether that be injury risk or performance.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. Yep. And one of the big problems that you face, and I went to a Women in Sport conference not that long ago held by Lateral.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed that conference. Sounded
it was quite
sounded
good.
Really good.
Yeah, it was actually really, really good. I really enjoyed it. But one of the things that I probably disagree with a little bit is I don't think that in an athlete's mind they should be considering that as being a negative effect.
Yep.
Right? Because the problem you've got is you can't pick when the competition is.
Yeah, that's...
I've had athletes going into major championships who they know they're about to get their period. And it's like, what do you want them to do? Freak out because all the data that you've collected before says, I can't perform at this time?
Yep.
That's not the mentality that you want to have.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to create systems around that.
Yep.
Whether that's pain management from a general point of view, and you've actually got to create opportunities for them to train and perform under conditions which they don't think are optimal.
Yep.
Because the moment that you start creating this even mental idea that their performance may be down because they're in a particular phase of their cycle, you're creating fragility.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous. Yeah, it's really dangerous.
Yeah, it undermines your confidence. But I guess that's one of the reasons we looked at the monophasic oral contraceptive pill, because it levels everything out at least from a hormonal perspective.
The thing that I would say with that, and you can correct me because my reading of this is more cursory, I'm sure, than yours. One of the things that I tended to see with that is it reduces things like, tendon and ligament injuries, but it actually can increase the amount of soft tissue, say muscular injuries, because of the changes in the stiffness properties of the actual connective tissue structures.
Is there data on that?
Yeah, well, at a very cursory level, it seems to be the case, and maybe that's more, as I said, hypothesis-driven than it is actually the data pointing that out, because it shifts. You don't have the tendon degradation, or you don't have, say, a ligament injury.
Yep.
And if that's more sturdy, then it's actually asking the muscle tissue to do more.
Yeah, look, it's a really good point.
And it's kind of the theory why males have, say, more soft tissue injuries to muscle versus to the tendon or the ligament compared to females.
Okay, so you're saying that the tendon becomes stiffer, less compliant,
and it's able to tolerate some of those things at a greater level.
And that puts more strain on the musculo.
Actually, that's a question you might know the answer to this too, John, is within sport, are females recommended to take the contraceptive pill then?
Often they are.
Yeah. And because does that really raise a moral dilemma too?
Yeah, well, this is the thing. Here's an example. None of the athletes, I coach 5 very, I would say, elite female sprinters.
Yeah.
None of them are on the pill, right? And the reason is,
that's interesting.
Some of them use other forms of contraception that are not hormone-based. The reason is none of them tolerate the hormone stuff in relation to other areas of their life.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So some have spoken about significant issues with mood, others with weight gain.
Yep.
And so they're like, I understand that there may be benefits, but I don't actually want to take it for these other reasons.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you say that, because every sports doctor you talk to, the first thing they try and do is put you on oral contraception. And it actually kind of pisses me off, because
I guess
it completely undermines the other aspects of the athlete's life. Like,
totally.
if they're walking around cranky as fuck because they're on this hormone-based, basically as a medication, life's not fun. So what's the point of, you don't want to go do the thing that you enjoy, which is usually sport, if you're not in the mood to do anything.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there is certainly would have to be a trade-off there.
Yeah.
It's interesting that of the athletes that you coach, so few of them are using them.
Well, none of them are.
Yeah.
I've got 5, but 3 of them have been to 2 of the Olympics, 1 to the Commonwealth Games.
Wow.
None of them use it.
That's interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, as I said, none of them seem to have tolerated it very well. And it's not necessarily to do with performance. It's actually to do with other areas of their life.
Yeah.
So I find it very interesting. And it's something like I've spoken to a number of them about this concept of are you interested in going down this path? But they've basically, most of them said no.
Okay. Sorry.
No, you go, Adam.
I was just going to say, I think that's an interesting sort of paradigm that you present there in terms of the trade-off between tendon injuries and muscular injuries.
Well, it's one of the, I think I saw a paper, I only read the abstract, but I saw a paper the other day that basically was suggesting that plyometric tasks may be the bridge that allow female athletes to have less of these joint injuries. And as a track and field coach, where things like plyometrics are a central part of our training, I've kind of been saying this to people, that's kind of a kind of analysis for things like team sports, where most of these athletes, I think, have had such little exposure to the dynamics of some of those sports and or the training history associated with that. And that will get better, obviously, with more exposure. But improving their ability to tolerate ground reaction forces in multiple directions and at multiple velocities is going to be a major factor.
Totally agree.
And it's quite interesting, because to me, I think it's one of the areas of not only rehabilitation and sports medicine research, but also I think in sports performance outside of things like track and field is an understanding of plyometrics is very poor.
There is, and it's kind of frustrating, because I mean, guys like both of you know about plyometrics, you know about how it affects the mechanics of the musculotendinous unit and that kind of thing, and it's not integrated into much. And unfortunately, a lot of people working in the health sciences, probably physios, don't really understand or haven't applied really these concepts of plyometrics either to prevention or to rehabilitation.
I'll give you a basic example. We have students in all the time. One of the things that one of the students said to us actually recently was doing their placement is, I don't really know anything about plyometrics, but it seems like you guys do a lot of this stuff. And I said to them, okay, well, there's a major reason for that. If you look at things like the actual function and the biomechanics of musculotendinous unit, there's a number of features that you're trying to externally be able to create. Some of them are about controlling the joint function. Others are about creating propulsion. And some of them are really about understanding how to create stability. And all of those features can happen across the whole spectrum of velocity. So some happen really slow and some happen really quickly. And you've got to know how to be able to kind of put interventions that attack those. And I was explaining to her, you know, we had someone...
This is good stuff, by the way. I love this stuff.
Well, we had someone in who had Achilles pain. And now we're lucky, you know, we do a plug for strength by numbers. And no, it's not research grade kind of testing, but it's high enough that we can get a pretty reasonable view of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
And we're looking at, say, like force outputs in their calf complex. Right? So we look at both seated and standing isometric calf force to have a look. Okay, is strength a factor that's leading to them developing Achilles pain?
That's terrific.
Right?
Yeah.
So we do that.
Yeah.
These people are measuring off the charts in terms of normative values. So, you know, you do a seated...
Normative strength for both.
Yeah, you do seated calf measures and they're getting over 200 times, like 200% of their body weight, or, you know, 2 times their body weight. You're doing standing and they're over, you know, 3 times their body weight. So you're like, okay, it's not that it couldn't be a factor, but it's less likely that that's the thing that caused them to develop this overload to their tendon structure.
Yeah, sure.
You go and measure, even of their uninjured side, their plyometric function. You look at something like an RSI, particularly single leg, and it's in the toilet. And you're like, okay, well, you didn't fail when you were doing a running task because strength was the reason. You failed because your elastic features and your rate of force development wasn't there.
That's interesting,
right?
Yeah. Terrific.
And that's this kind of thing that I said to her. I was like, so we can't go around implementing a protocol that often gets put forward by tendon researchers. Got to get them really strong. You got to do lots of isometric loading. Then you got to do concentric, then eccentric. That stuff is almost useless for that person because they're already capping out those force producing features. Now, could we get them to produce more force? Yeah, we could. But the bigger thing that we need to do is drive up their ability to do it at high rates of force development, and also do it under, you know, that early RFD stuff, that really elastic, you know, less than 250 milliseconds, things like drop catches, drop landings, drop jumps, change of directions, things that are really quick and often are the things that actually are important for sports performance or injury development. So when she sees us doing lots of jumps and hops and all, she's like, why are you doing so much? I was like, because their problem's not at the low velocity end of the problem. It's at the high velocity end. And I think that that's one of the key features that we seem to see that is often not explored. Now, we're not trying to be arrogant. There's lots of awesome practitioners and researchers looking at this stuff, but I think it's less so than maybe some of those lower velocity features.
And like you mentioned before, the behaviour of the muscle tendon unit is going to change rapidly as well. I think that's where people often get caught out, is assuming that you're going to get this transfer of a low velocity, high force activity into a high velocity, high force.
This is the key feature, and I know that...
Well, it's actually probably, I know we talked about this briefly, but it's probably worth talking to you about it too, Adam, where we often, I think we see this issue at the moment within physiotherapy of thinking about physiological adaptations and trying to do an exercise to see a change in, say, muscle architecture and getting too removed from the biomechanical requirements of the particular task. And like we see that obviously in particular with looking at, say, heavy eccentric training for hamstrings, could be any muscle where...
fascicle length changes and pronation angles and all these kind of things.
And there seems to be, well, John and I have had this conversation before where you see this correlation of people with longer fascicle lengths seem to have a lower risk of injury. Doing heavy eccentric seems to reduce injury risk, and it also increases fascicle length. It's this issue then too of the correlation causation, because I often look at it too of how often do we give someone an exercise like a Nordic where you go, all right, this is the exercise you're going to do. You probably won't be able to do it. You're probably going to fail doing it. But I want you to do it, and over time it's going to improve your fascicle length, and that's going to help mitigate injury. And I look at it and I'm like, well, how often do you get someone to do an exercise where you say to failure and like, well, you're not going to be able to do this, but we're going to work on it over time until you're going to be able to do it? Because you don't get someone to do a back squat and say, all right, we're going to load it up because we know that you're going to be able to maybe lower it, but you won't be able to push it back up. And it's funny because I look at it and I'm like, well, what's the key characteristics here? You're just actually overloading the system, creating improvements in strength capacity and mechanical tension through the myofascial system, or is it because you're creating a specific architectural change?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be a superb research question, actually. In terms of, I guess people have looked at that in sort of individual bite-sized pieces, but no one's really put it together. It's a really good question.
Well, I just also think too, and it's probably a criticism of our own profession, is we tend to really focus on that low force, low velocity end of the spectrum too.
Totally.
You know, like think about what are key characteristics of what you see a lot of physiotherapists prescribe: TheraBand work, Pilates work, body weight work, and obviously you need to develop those characteristics. But all of a sudden, when you're starting to advocate for doing heavy eccentric training from an injury prevention, you're starting to develop that real high force end of the spectrum. And it's not something that I think is really commonly used within our profession.
It's not used in, the funny thing is, it's not used in other areas. The two areas it gets used is in tendon, right? And in hamstring injuries. But people aren't using it, say, like with OA.
Principle.
No one's going, let's maximally eccentrically overload this person who has knee OA. Why? Because it's not that different to the degenerative tendon that they go, well, you've got to put maximum isometric force through this.
Exactly. So I guess I was fortunate, and probably giving away my age here, but in the 90s, I was fortunate because the lab in which I was working at that time.
Was this when you were in Queensland?
No, I was when I was actually in Lismore at Southern Cross University, and I mean, it's certainly not a high-ranking university with respect to drawing in huge amounts of research funding, but there was some fantastic work that was going on there in the 90s with Rob Newton.
Oh, yeah.
So Rob's
great.
now in
ECU.
ECU, sorry.
In WA,
And he's doing a lot of work around exercise and cancer. And Greg Wilson was there at the time, and we had visitors like Hacken and they were linked in with Comey and all those guys. These concepts aren't new, man.
No, these pioneers were doing this stuff in the 80s.
25, 30, 40 years ago.
I love reading some of those IOC textbooks and some of the Comey stuff from the early 2000s.
That was terrific stuff.
There's fantastic stuff in that,
Lost some height, mate.
I've lost some height there. Yeah, so I don't know why it's because everything that you're talking about in terms of heavy eccentric lows, looking at the velocity of contraction and how that relates to functionality, that was all done back then in healthy cohorts. So we've understood this stuff for decades. But I don't know why it's taken so long to cross-pollinate. I don't know what the right word is to make the transition into the clinical sciences in terms of, because you guys are sort of at the pointy end of this kind of work.
I think we're lucky because we obviously went off and did study in exercise science, so we kind of got exposed to like, oh wait, there's more to this conversation. And it's we're lucky to have people like yourself to talk to these things about, because you went and said, okay, we can actually validate that maybe these concepts aren't stupid.
So I had
I think the only way too that the way, like talking back, similar to you, Adam, John and I know are very similar in that we actually want to be generalists, and the only way that you can be a generalist is to understand principles. Because it's not like you can remember hundreds of articles and the conclusions. But you start to see certain themes emerge from the research and go, okay, cool. Like if I start to add velocity to a particular exercise, this is the behavior of the myofascial system and so on. So I think that's one of the things that I know we really advocate for is don't get too caught up in all the weeds and nuances of the specifics of the research if you're a clinician.
I think the point that you made before was really interesting, like people searching for the adaptations to tissue, but actually if you just take the principle of like, all right, well, I'm going to maximally overload someone, and that had a really good effect, that probably tells you something about the intervention that you need to put in place. It's something that at least challenges them to a reasonably high level.
Exactly.
Well, and it's like, I often think of that just from a basic exercise prescription standpoint is, what are the mechanics of the movement? What are the particular areas of the body that I'm loading? And how do I alter the variables to increase or decrease the mechanical load?
That's perfect. And what you're saying is you can't remember hundreds of research papers that have looked at this stuff, but you've got those three concepts that you keep coming back to.
As opposed to the idea of, what's a good hamstring exercise, and I think that's sometimes where people get stuck, is assuming that an exercise provides a solution to all the essential adaptations you need to mitigate injury, and I think it misses some of the bigger principles or key things you need to think about from an exercise prescription standpoint.
Yeah, and I mean, To be quite honest with you, I think if you're not at the coalface like you guys are, I mean, that's why I enjoy these sort of conversations. You're missing a lot of this stuff because you can only really pick up so much of it in textbooks or research papers, unless you talk to guys like you at the coalface who are sort of, you know, working with athletes every day and trialling different things. I think you miss it. So that's why I like to talk to clinicians like yourselves who are working very closely with athletes or clinical cohorts, because this is where ideas are generated. Because otherwise you just sit in front of your computer reading research papers and it's kind of harder to put the pieces together. But
how do you do that, Adam? Because obviously you put on the hat of being a researcher, but I think one of your strengths is that you actually zoom out a little bit and go, well, how is this actually going to be used? Is there a process that you go through to do that?
Yeah, I suppose so. So again, I sort of come back to the key principles. I like to think, you know, I don't know, I can't remember all the details of hundreds and hundreds of papers, but I like to come back to things that matter and think about applications to the real world. So we've tried to do that, for example, with our footwear, where we've looked at load modifying features in footwear so that we unload the joints in different ways. But clearly that kind of stuff needs to be combined with the plyometrics and things like that you're talking about. But yeah, I try to think creatively when I...
Is there a formal process for you? Will you sit down and go, okay, this is the topic, what are the other potential things that we can explore with it? Do you actually do that?
Yeah, I do, yeah. So I like to sort of go into the lab and just sort of think generally about, you know, what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, what else can we take from this project? So for example, with one of our linkage grants, it was really about the effects of footwear on young girls in terms of, you know, levels of maturation. So what we developed a whole line of research around the effects of puberty on lower limb biomechanics. And fortunately now we've actually got an ACL model. So we can actually calculate ACL forces in vivo, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And I didn't develop it. I mean, I worked on the projects. I worked on the validation process of the ACL model, and we were the first to sort of publish that. And now we're publishing papers looking at ACL force on footwear. So I've just got a PhD student who's finishing in that space. But yeah, I think I like to think creatively. And as I said, I get bored very quickly. And I think I'm a relatively good creative thinker. I think there are other people who think more logically than I do. My thinking's a little bit disorganised, but you've kind of got that randomness that comes about, you know, that entropy that people talk about in terms of, you know, the collision of ideas rather than being fixed into a little box.
I get really enamoured by this kind of concept because I think, to me, this is where true innovation happens, as you said, when there's a little bit of entropy kind of running through the system. Yeah. Do you have people that you go to, or do you have processes you go through where you're trying to bounce some of the maybe more crazy ideas that you have off, you know, other team members or people that you deal with? Yeah.
So that's a really good question. So I like to, in our group and in our extended group of researchers, they're not all based obviously in Melbourne. You know, we've got a good collaboration with the guys at Griffith Uni and other places, and, you know, bouncing some of the ideas off people who are a little bit like myself, you know, that's good because, you know, we come up with other sort of different ways of looking at things. But then again, I've got other colleagues who are more sort of pragmatic and single-minded, and they can sometimes pull us back into line a little bit rather than being too wacky in terms of what we're trying to do and sort of trying to be too out there, I suppose.
You need a bit of both, I guess. Cause it's one of those things of, if there's too many of those people who are gung-ho, you end up down a path and you're like, oh, wait. Yeah, we've gone too far here.
Yeah, so and we've got some fantastic people who can do that within our team. So Rana Hinman's a classic example. You know, she's a fantastic thinker, but she's also very pragmatic in terms of saying, hey, you know, we need to sort of pull that back in a little bit, and, you know, what's possible. And the other thing you got to think about as well in research is, you know, how much time and commitment can you demand of your participants? I mean, we all want to do thousands of different tests, but, you know, when you've got them there for 3.5 hours and they're sort of yawning and looking at their watch and, you know, trying to get out of there, then, you know, you've got to have the right balance. And I'm probably not so good at finding that balance. That's why I need sort of people who are a bit more pragmatic and realistic Whereas I'm sort of a bit of a dreamer. You need really those people who can also pull you back into line and say, well, that's probably not going to work.
Is that something that you developed professionally, or do you think that was kind of something that you normally seek out anyway?
Yes, it's probably something I'd seek out anyway. So when I left school, I had two choices. So I got into art school and I got into science. And it was basically a coin toss because I love art, I love visual art.
I didn't know that. What kind of art did?
Sculpting and painting and drawing and that kind of thing.
Are you an artist yourself?
I wouldn't call myself an artist now. I do a lot of photography and I do a lot of abstract photography, but certainly wouldn't call myself an artist. But I think that sort of creative thinking, that sort of artistic thinking, or maybe you call it, that kind of enables you to look at things quite differently to other people. Whereas, as I said, some people are really quite pragmatic and sensible. I'm probably not not like that. I've got more of that sort of I don't know what you call it, just
open-minded.
Just open-minded, I suppose.
Yeah.
Just in terms of getting bored very quickly and thinking, well, that was interesting, now I need to move on. Whereas I see other people who are probably more successful than I and publish a lot more papers in certain areas than I do. But the problem that I've had is, you do something and you think, oh, well, that idea is also interesting, so I better go and chase down that rabbit path.
It reminds me so much of the George Bernard Shaw's essay, The Fox and the Hedgehog.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me of that one, John.
Well, it's great because it talks about the difference between a fox, and the fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one thing.
Yeah.
And it's that different system of...
It's a great analogy.
Yeah, well, it's not mine, obviously.
Yeah, but it's good to
as I said, as the fox, you're constantly interested in different things.
Yeah.
You're looking at different things. You're moving from one thing to the other.
Yeah.
And not that one's better than the other, but you tend to find that people who are more in that hedgehog model of they like working on one thing and they kind of just keep ticking away.
Yeah.
They may get deeper into one area.
Yeah.
The interesting part about this, which I think is the caveat, because I think it goes both ways. On the surface, it probably seems like you should be a hedgehog.
Yeah.
But...
certainly for winning grants, you need to be a hedgehog.
Well, but the thing is, if you look at I don't know if you've read the book Range by David Epstein.
No, I haven't.
I think you'd really like it.
I feel like we've given a shout out to that book so many times now.
Hopefully David puts a shout out for us.
You might have talked to me about that book before.
Anyway, what's the subtitle? It's like...
why generalists succeed in a specialised world.
I'm pretty sure we've had this conversation.
You should definitely read it. It's a great book. But one of the things that he points out, and he uses that analogy, is that the hedgehog's not usually the person that comes through with a major breakthrough. Yeah. And the reason is because they're so focused, they just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper, and they can tell you the intricacies of everything.
They do.
But they don't see the bigger picture. And a really dumb example he uses in the book, I think I've brought this up before in the podcast, but is when they were trying to solve the problem of oil spills, there's a real problem that they have where they can't, because it turns underwater, it turns into sludge.
Yep.
They can't remove it. They can't remove it particularly easily.
Yep.
And so what this guy did, which was really interesting, he came up with this idea which was based on these vibration sticks that they use for concreting.
Okay.
So if you're a concreter, and the concrete starts to go too hard, and you need to make it into liquid again,
you need to perturbate it.
Well, you perturbate it with this vibration stick.
Yeah,
and so what they basically created was this enormous vibration stick stuck in the water, and then they were easily able to remove oil from the water.
That's fantastic.
And it sounds like the dumbest concept come from concreting to environmental protection and cleanup.
That's cool.
But it didn't come from some scientist or even someone who's like a chemical engineer. It came from this guy who was like, I remember my brother-in-law talking about this when he was a concreter. Yeah. I think this might work, and it did.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing of being the fox sometimes allows you to see things that other people can't, because you're like, I remember that from there, I'm going to pull this from here.
Yeah. I think the other big one too is psychological traits, because I think the people who tend to be more lateral in their thinking are okay with uncertainty, because one of the issues I think with say how I think and reading lots of different areas, you start to realize that the puzzle just keeps getting bigger and bigger, which can be quite overwhelming because you just think like, shit, what am I doing? Like, what do I need to work on? Whereas opposed to this idea of being quite uni-focused, you can have that false sense of security of like, I know it all. You know, I've read all the literature on this topic and it's sorted basically.
Yeah, you've got that control over a single domain. You know, every paper that's been published. But again, I mean, I think that kind of thinking and that kind of research is great for winning research grants because you know, if you've got 200 or 300 papers that all look at, I don't know, stroke research or osteoarthritis or tendon injuries, whatever it might be, then you're going to be a lot more successful than probably someone like myself who's got, you know, quite a few papers, but they're in lots and lots of different areas. But I think, it's good to think that way, but it's also good in terms of, you know, this kind of process helps me a lot by talking to people like yourselves and other people, you know, because you pick up, as you said, John, you know, bits and pieces here and there, and you can sort of start to piece it together in your mind a little bit more. So that's the great thing. I mean, you've got that entropy internally and you've got it externally as well because you're talking to interesting people in different headspaces and different expertise. And I've picked up a lot from today just listening to you guys.
We're not done yet, mate. You're trying to leave.
No, I'm not trying to leave.
I'm
just trying to be complimentary.
I actually want to go back to, there's a question I realised I didn't answer before when we were talking about hormonal factors related to tissue mechanics. Do you know of any research looking at things like phytoestrogen, so, you know, estrogenic compounds in food like soy or beer, or even things like, I know BPA is another big one that has essentially a very similar structure to estrogens having an impact on tissue mechanics as well.
Look, that's a fantastic question, and I don't know the answer.
Because of the prevalence of certain foods we eat or getting exposure to plastics. Yeah,
look, it's a really good question.
Maybe that's what happened with the rugby team and all their Achilles ruptures. Too much beer.
Yeah, you're talking about men or women?
Well, I guess both really, in a sense,
Well, it's that whole thing of why there's all these men who say, I won't drink soy milk and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I guess they're well, I don't know the areas. You guys might know more about it than me, but, you know, rising estrogen levels in men.
And decreasing testosterone.
Decreasing testosterone. And that's a big issue.
Absolutely.
Like, surely it has to have an effect on connective tissue structure.
You'd have to think so. I mean, if you've got
a systemic effect.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, female tissue obviously has estrogen receptors and male tissue has estrogen receptors as well. You know, I mean, and you see that from bodybuilders, for example, who take too much testosterone and you got aromatization of, and, you know, you get those estrogen-related effects like the breast development and that kind of thing. It's a really good question, though, and I think I'm more concerned about the declining testosterone levels probably. You know, and as you get older, you know, thinking about ways to actually maintain those estrogen testosterone levels. But I'm not aware of any research in tendon or tissue mechanics around that, Jack. It's a really good question.
Well, maybe that's another study you can do.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Maybe some work has been done there, but I don't know.
Potentially, I'm not familiar with them myself. I just know I'm familiar with some of the issues associated with certain foods and just pollutants, because I think that's the other issue that we have, and probably a factor contributing to the decline in testosterone among some of the other big things.
You're right. Yeah. It's it is a concern. It's and, you know, as we get older, you know, obviously, well, the argument is obviously that our testosterone levels as men drop. And I've had this conversation recently with quite a few older bodybuilders, and it's like, well, you know, I'm not the type of person to go down a back alleyway and buy, you know, steroids or whatever it might be. But they sort of come to me and they say, well, women have hormone replacement when they get older. Why don't men have the same luxury? What's going on there? Why can't we?
There has been a huge movement in this, particularly in the US, of testosterone replacement therapy.
There has.
I think a lot of people use it almost prematurely, but
they do, yeah.
But as an excuse to take steroids.
Yeah, but I mean, to your point though, too, Adam, like thinking of the prevalence, I think people sometimes are a bit dismissive of when you think about something like mental health and how so many lifestyle factors and hormonal factors influence how we feel and how we behave.
That's what I was going to say, actually, psychologically.
Totally, and you know, particularly when you look at the prevalence of things like testosterone levels declining, and people feeling unhappy, there's so many things that you can do, and perhaps one of those is taking exogenous substances, but the other one is, the big ones, resistance training,
totally,
sunlight exposure, vitamin D, saturated fat intake,
zinc, all of that sort
as in
of
getting
stuff.
more saturated fat in your diet.
Definitely.
That's obviously a big thing related to testosterone.
Yeah, it is, and I mean that sort of stuff hasn't been encouraged really.
No, quite to the opposite, isn't it?
Quite the opposite. It's more based around a high carb approach, whereas I think we're learning now that
that has its dangerous effects if it's not controlled.
Yeah, but a saturated fat, which is high in protein, a diet which is high in protein and saturated fat is actually good for, in a lot of respects.
I don't know if it exists, but do you think we'll get to the point where there will be injury research that starts to look at these kind of factors for prevalence and the changes that we see in, say, whether it's ACL or tendon structure damage relating to things like diet and, say, maybe even circulating hormone levels?
Good question. I mean, certainly hormonal levels would be something you could easily look at quite easily, because the hormonal tests now are getting fairly accessible. I mean, for our research and our recent research, we measure estrogen levels using salivary tests. I mean, they still need to go to the lab for ELISA analysis.
But it's pretty easy to take,
It's pretty easy to do now. So, I mean, if you're looking at that kind of research, you could conceivably measure hormonal levels across a number of years, and you could relate that to diet and exercise and all of those kinds of things. Certainly hormonal. Diet might be a little harder. I don't know.
Well, I was about to say, I know there is some research already, because I know, again, being controversial, but one of there are some studies, and I can't remember if they're observational or prospective of looking at fibre intake and testosterone. And
is that right?
Again, higher fibre intake is associated with lower testosterone levels.
Sense.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, I think part of the issue, though, too, here is, if you're eating more fibre, you're typically replacing that with eating less animal products. So you're getting less protein in the form of animal
saturated
protein
fats,
and less saturated fat, and not to mention all the other micronutrients in animal protein, like zinc as a big one, for example.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and that's what I was going to say as well. Obviously, fiber's associated with your complex carbohydrates, so maybe that's part of it.
But I think also, to answer your question, John, I think you see that more as a proxy in looking at more vulnerable population groups, so elderly and younger adolescents and children. Because, again, if you look at the elderly people, it's so clear that one of the biggest risk factors for developing chronic disease is the amount of muscle mass you have. Yeah. And then one of the big things related to muscle mass is...
It's funny, because you made
nutrition.
One of the things I was thinking about, and I actually thought about this recently, because earlier in the year my grandpa died, right? And
mine too. Yeah,
he was
sorry to hear that.
You too, mate. He was a very healthy guy. He lived on his own up until, and we believe he had a heart attack or something. We're not really sure, but they're not going to do an autopsy on a 92-year-old.
It's 92,
He was still living on his own in a retirement village, but in his own apartment, doing everything.
Pretty independent, basically.
Very independent. But one of the things that was interesting is his protein intake went down. He was someone, he smoked for a long time and drank his whole life and all that kind of thing. But he used to eat a lot of meat. However, as he got older, particularly in the last few years, his teeth were no good. So he stopped eating meat because he actually was struggling to chew the food. And I've been thinking about that for older people is one of the reasons that they eat less protein and therefore preserve less muscle mass, actually not to do with not wanting to eat it or the cost, but actually practically it's not as easy to chew a steak as it is to eat soft carbohydrate-based foods.
I think the other one with that, speaking of this conversation,
it seems stupid because it's so practical and simple, but it could have a major effect on even longevity.
Well, my dad's
quality of life.
Really good point.
I grew up in northwest New South Wales. My dad's still there, and he's down this weekend. And he was complaining to me yesterday that he's been putting on weight, and he's typically he's quite tall himself, being very physically active, but just slowly putting on weight. And I'm like, all right, Dad, what do you eat? And the problem he has adopted is he's from that. He's like in his 70s, so he thinks that fat is bad, particularly saturated fat, and that eating less is better. And that's the other big one for him. So when he told me what he eats, it's like, one, you just don't eat enough protein in general, and he avoids any fat whatsoever. And I think one of the other big issues he has is he goes, well, if I just starve myself, I'm going to be better. But it's like, well, the problem that you have, Dad, is one, that's not the case because calories in, calories out is not the complete equation. But two, your protein requirements as you get older are higher and you're losing muscle mass. So as a result, your metabolism's going down the toilet. And it's one of those messages too of the messaging from the, you know, conventional wisdom says you shouldn't eat animal protein, or you shouldn't eat saturated fat, and the consequences of that become more obvious the older that you get.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, like you said, Jack, I think we've been indoctrinated with this food pyramid our entire lives. I mean, I'm older than you guys, but, you know, we grew up with, you know, your meats and saturated fats, you know, at the top of the pyramid.
Totally.
And then, you know, you've got your veggies and your
cereals
and bread down the bottom, you know, which should comprise most of your diet. But, you know, I think people are now coming around and saying, well, the whole pyramid's upside down.
Yeah.
You know, you should be having more meat.
I think cakes are at the top. I think
cakes are at the top. Yeah.
I had this actually conversation with someone recently. My girlfriend's mother recently got diagnosed with osteoporosis.
Okay.
And she read this book and said, "Oh, it's easy. I've just got to start eating less animal protein."
Yep.
I was like, where does that come from? And so I literally just put together dozens and dozens of articles, because I mean, one area that's quite clear is looking at the correlation, and there's also prospective studies of animal protein and bone development.
Yeah.
But it's such a prevalent message in our society still.
Yeah,
and
it still is.
and something I'm always interested about, particularly from an injury perspective as well.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask Adam, because I think this is a good lead in. One of the areas that's starting to get really interesting, I think, is this combination of specific nutrients for injury management. And I think one of the people that's pioneering a lot of this is someone like Keith Barr. He's done a lot of work with, you know, the gelatin or collagen intake and its effect on tendon healing, particularly when it's paired with an appropriate mechanical stimulus.
Okay, I don't know a lot about this.
Oh,
John,
really?
but
Okay, I was going to ask you.
Happy.
I thought you might actually be able to give us a bit more input. But one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which is more general, is do you think we're going to start seeing more of this kind of stuff where not only are we applying the right mechanical stimulus, we're also pairing that with the right, you know, nutritional support for the building blocks of that tissue. And then the last part, which Jack and I spoke about a while ago in one of our podcasts, is it has to be in the right metabolic environment. Like if you're unhealthy and you're in, say, a very high, you know, you've got metabolic syndrome or something like that, the way you absorb things and the way that your body responds to things is not the same. But on those first two, do you think that that's going to, you know, we spoke before about mechanical loading, but I think the nutritional stuff, and to put some context on, like, your background, as you said, you have had a lot of affiliation with powerlifting and even some bodybuilders and things. If you spoke to any of them about not doing the nutrition side of the conversation, they'd be like, you're an idiot. You can do all the training you like.
Exactly.
You're not going to get the...
Yeah, so again, I mean, if you come back, you know, to the golden age of bodybuilding, for example, I was listening to a podcast on this yesterday. And
they're like the Schwarzenegger era?
Yeah, the Schwarzenegger area, the Franco Colombo area, you know, and they were talking about aesthetics, and they were talking about, you know, propensity for injury and all of those sort of things compared with the modern day bodybuilders, you know, and modern day bodybuilders, you know, some of them phenomenal, particularly in that classic physique like the Chris Bumsteads and that kind of thing. But a lot of them are quite puffy. They're not very aesthetic,
and they actually don't look healthy at all.
They don't look healthy, and unfortunately, some of them are starting to die off quite young. You know, but the interesting thing about that was they were talking about this golden era of bodybuilding, and as you mentioned, Schwarzenegger, and they were sort of trying to break it down and saying, well, why are these guys more aesthetic? You know, why do they look more athletic? Why are their muscles denser?
For people who don't understand, if you look at someone even like the Schwarzenegger, yes, he was very big, but he was...
He's nothing like your Ronnie Coleman type.
Yeah, he basically looked like the statues that, you know, are in Europe. He's just...
And Adonis.
And just they've pumped them up a little bit more. Right?
But the argument that this guy was taking was, if you look at the diets of those athletes, and, I mean, they trained really hard too. I mean... I think
6 to 8 hours a day sort of in the gym,
6 to 8 hours a day at high intensity. So they were breaking it up into 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours at night. And I mean, that's
a
hard
big session
to get your head around. I mean, you guys here, you know, you've got, you know, you've obviously got access to lots of equipment and lots of, you know, you've got lots of experience with training people, and to train people for 6 hours a day is probably quite mind-blowing.
Absolutely.
But the other thing that they said is, if you look at their diets, and they use, you know, those top bodybuilders of that era, Basically, their diet was a ketogenic diet. It was high in animal proteins, so they ate a lot of red meat.
Yeah, and lots a lot of eggs and stuff like that.
Huge amount of eggs, lots of cheese, very few fruit and vegetables, and all very, very few carbohydrates. So if you look at that compared to today's bodybuilders and maybe today's strength athletes, I know less about that, but they typically have a fairly high carbohydrate intake. So his argument was that, you know, this diet that's sort of focused on that high protein with very limited carbohydrate produced these athletes that, you know, aesthetically were hard and they were strong, and they didn't have this sort of puffed out, sort of unhealthy look to them. It was more around, you know, looking more aesthetic and pleasing.
Yeah, I think that, you know, working very closely with a number of dietitians, I think one of the problems that you face without having some carbohydrate intake for that level of intense training is it can have a very long-term deleterious effects on hormone profile.
Totally agree.
On things like cortisol and how that sort of functions. So
I think you've got to get the balance right.
Yeah, because aesthetically you can look great, but actually be really unhealthy.
Yeah, so I guess everything in moderation, but it was an interesting take on it.
Yeah.
And I'd often wondered about that myself, because, I mean, they were taking less performance-enhancing drugs. You know, they had less protein powder, they had less supplements, but what was it about them that made them that golden era? What made them better?
Well, that's the other thing I think of too, is during that era, because there was less supplementation, were they were probably eating a lot more whole food.
Foods,
and, you know,
has its benefits.
You think about all the, I don't know if you've heard of Stefan Van Vliet, who's at, I think, Kentucky University, or maybe it's Duke University. He's done research of looking at food in the whole food matrix.
That's a good name. Can you say that again?
Van Vliet, I think he's Dutch.
Right.
What a name.
And so, you know, he's looked at things like eating whole egg versus just the egg whites. Where, again, it's like match for protein calorie intake. And when you're having the yolk, where you're getting the fat, but also a lot of these fat-soluble vitamins and minerals. And to no surprise, you're seeing a greater increase in protein synthesis and increase in cross-sectional area from having the whole food form.
As I said, the big point out of all is I just can't see that we're not going to have more research that says you have to pair these things together.
Definitely, totally agree. Yeah,
that's actually a question I wanted to ask you, Adam's good segue of, you know, one of the things that I'm critical of in my complete naivety about research, because I'm not a researcher, is we still follow this model of everything being very controlled. And I understand the purpose of that, of looking at this dependent variable, but as we're alluding to here, there's typically lots of different factors that influence adaptation in the human body.
That's right,
and more importantly, in the real world, we're not trying to control things. We're going to be looking at physical training factors, dietary factors, sleep, and so on. Is that something that you think needs to change in terms of the kind of research questions we ask and how we conduct research?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I think as technology improves, I think we're actually able to do that better. So, I mean, there's technologies now for monitoring sleep. I'm actually in the process. I teach a subject called Innovation and Emerging Technology, and I'm just writing a new module for that. And just looking at all the wearable technologies that are available. So you can look at sleep, you can look at heart rate, oxygen concentration, and then there are other wearables for looking at muscle activity, brain activity. Obviously, there's apps for diet and nutrition. So I think we're getting now to the point where you can measure things that you weren't actually able to measure before.
Speaking of which, I read an article recently where they developed technology where you can create this tattoo that monitors heart rate, blood pressure, blood oxygenation, and so on. Like, it's getting quite unbelievable, and the things that you can measure.
It's getting, it's quite impressive. Some of that stuff does scare me in terms of, you know,
being able to monitor everything,
and whether that becomes no longer a choice, but it becomes forced upon us in terms of monitoring everything that we do. But it's a really good question, Jack, and I think with the wearables that we're actually able to get now, and, you know, being able to measure things in the field that we weren't actually able to measure before. So we're working with a company called Sportsentia, and they've got an instrumented insole, for example, and they've got, you know, 10 sensors. So they can measure medial versus lateral.
Are they selling those now?
Couple of months. Yeah, early in 23.
Can you let me know? Because I was going to get one from that company I told you in Canada, but I haven't kind of committed to it yet.
Yeah, so they're going to actually sponsor our research with ASICS coming up.
Nice.
Right.
But what you can do from that is you can get things like cumulative load over, a game, or whether, for example, if you were coming in here during a session, you could actually, work out how many thousands of kilos of load you've imposed on someone, and that's probably some of the applications you could use, John. But it also gives you things like, how far you've run, the directions that you've run, velocity, acceleration, whether you've moved backwards and forwards or side to side. So I think integrating all of that, and I think using sort of standard data analysis for that kind of thing it's too much. I mean, in terms of looking at point analyses and using SPSS or something like that to analyse that data, it's impossible, and I think that's why people are starting to use the neural networks and the AI.
I think we spoke with someone who came on, a guy named David McCloskey, who works in data management, and I think it brings up that point that he said of like the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning with the kind of studies they do. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more people, now that the technology will go there, as you said, with these neural networks and things, you'll be able to pull out these data points and see, okay, well, this seem to be the contributors in this very complex picture.
Definitely.
They're not all of it, but these are the big rocks.
Exactly.
These are the things for that individual that seem to keep propping up their emergent behavior or emergent pattern.
Yeah, because I guess that's the thing, isn't it? Like, it probably makes sense when we think about, we live in this world where we're collecting more and more data, but it's like, what do you do with it? But if you've got these neural networks to go, okay, well, from this data set, it's actually variable A, B, C that you need to be
and
cognizant of this person.
I think so, yeah.
The thing that I'm finding really interesting, like we spoke about it a couple of weeks ago when we talked about load monitoring, and I don't know if I've told you this before, Adam, but I use a system for my athletes called a Megawave, comes out of Finland. I'm finding it super helpful. But what I'm finding super interesting is it takes a whole series of measures, but different measures are different, important for different people.
I think that's so important in terms of personalised approach.
I'll get a measure for one person, and I'll go, that's fine for them.
Yeah.
And if I get that same measure for someone else, I'm like, oh, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Right. Or a different measure might be important for a different person.
Exactly.
So like this measure, I don't even look at that for that person.
Exactly.
Whereas with this one, and I think that's what we'll hopefully start to get with these wearables, especially even if it's like in the shoe. When this person's cumulative load goes to this, they get injured. But for this other person, cumulative load is not even something that you ever consider because it doesn't seem to be the driver of their injuries. Theirs tends to be more, I don't know, the maximal forces that go through with, in their ground reactions or whatever it is.
You said it beautifully, John, better than I could. So I think this approach to personalised, I don't know what you call it, athletic training or healthcare or clinical.
The question then comes, how does that then inform something like research? Because how do you actually publish a paper that says, it's different for every person you deal with? It's like, great.
Yeah, look, and that's
humans are complex adaptive systems.
Yes, and that's where it's become so complex, and what Jack was saying about, the neural networks. So take our footwear research as a good example that fits into the paradigm that you guys are talking about. So we're testing commercially available shoes, or we test prototypes, and we bring in 50 to 100 girls and we test them. So what you kind of find is that there's kind of some girls
clusters clusters that you put together.
There are people that respond well to, for example, high medial arch support and a low heel pitch, whereas others don't. But the problem with it is that you throw them all in together, and so you're getting the washout of some of the beneficial effects and attenuation of some of the benefits in those individuals.
And this is something I know Jack talks about a lot, but do you think that we'll ever get to the point where research actually discusses the differences that they get in the results of the cohort they study? Because you end up getting the average numbers. But you often don't hear them talk about, well, we had these high responders here, these moderate responses, these no responders. And they don't actually talk about the interest, because to me that's way more interesting than the average number was this. Yes, on average it was valuable, or it had an effect size of X. But to me, it's actually more interesting to go, when we did it, we found that there was this profile, and this profile. And if you see these things, they're likely to probably fit into that, and therefore this intervention's good, or it might not be the best intervention for that person.
Yeah, look, I think there's a trend away from, your standard statistics and talking more about, your 95% confidence intervals and that kind of thing, which does encapsulate some of the variation within the cohort. The problem that we do have in terms of looking at responders and non-responders is that you need to have a lot of participant numbers. So if you've only got 100 participants and you only have, say, 15 who are responders, and most of them are somewhere in the middle, and then you've got 15 at the bottom end which are non-responders, then your statistical power is a little bit iffy, I suppose. But now we're sort of moving, as we're coming back to Jack's point in terms of big data and wearables. I think there exists the possibility to do that kind of research a lot more. And again, coming back to your point, Jack, I think there's a good opportunity to do both of those paradigms in terms of looking at a well-controlled experiment. So, for example, footwear research, but complementing that with the big data, with the wearables, and working out what people are doing outside the test sessions and how that might actually fill the gaps in terms of how they perform in the lab, if that makes any sense.
Well, I think what you say there's something that I always think about with any research is the variability in the data. I'm sure could be explained if you started to look at more of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, like if you started to expand it out, because the reality is, I know you try to find a homogenous group of people, but that's also based on the parameters of who you include. But I think the reality is the more we learn, the more we realise, there's probably these other variables we need to consider with our population group, and because the reality is there's obviously heterogeneity within every population group, and hence why we get variability in the results.
Again, I mean, you say you're not a researcher, but you've got more of an understanding of research than most people. I guess it comes back to this concept of internal versus external validity. So do you want to control the hell out of everything, and then you've got a very specific answer in terms of what it is that you're looking at. So if you come back to footwear research, if we manipulate a little small aspect of the footwear, does it change, ACL forces or something like that? But by the same token, it's also important to look at the external validity in terms of, the tasks that you perform, combining lots of different footwear design features and that kind of thing. So it's hard to get the balance right in terms of looking at internal versus external validity. But I certainly think with the wearables and the big data, I think we're actually able to answer a lot of these questions with more precision than before. And, one of the leaders in biomechanics in Australia, David Lloyd, I've had this conversation with him and David Saxby, who also works part of that group, and David's a good friend as well. And, they're talking now about, not having labs anymore in terms of, these wearables are getting now to the point they're so good that you can come into a space like this.
Yeah, you take that data,
You can wear your instrumented insoles, and, there's really good video technology now, like Open Pose, where you don't have to digitize, and there's amazing things that you can do. So it's becoming so accessible, so cheap, and so precise that before too much longer you'll be able to do things in here that we can do in our
lab,
our lab, which is decked out with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. So I think it's exciting.
You're talking about your ACL model made me think of a question I wanted to ask before too, because you said you've got this model now that is very accurate at measuring ACL forces, and so you're obviously seeing some changes in ACL forces with footwear. So does this model then take into look at things like tension and contraction of musculature through the lower limb, and how that obviously affects shear forces at the tibia and femur, and like how much force is distributed through the soft tissue system versus the joint articular system and all this kind of stuff?
Look, that's a really good question, and it's a complicated question.
Okay.
So the models that we use, we use lots of different things. So we use the kinematics, so we use the joint angles, we use the kinetics, so the force plate data. But one of the main things, or one of the other important things, is looking at the strength of the muscle groups and also the activity of the muscle groups, because these models are EMG driven. So we use all of that data, and within the models we think about the hill components. So we think about the active components, and we think about the passive components. But the level at which you can regulate those things is is arguably not as precise as it could be sort of moving forward. But, there are people looking more and more at those, very specific contributions.
Because it reminds us even of the research that you guys did. I think it was with Andy Franklin Miller looking at the cadavers.
The fascia stuff.
Which is such an interesting study itself.
Yeah, it was an interesting study. It was fun to
Chris Briggs and that too.
Chris was fantastic with that. He really helped us a lot. Wasn't a particularly fun study to collect the data from. It was, fresh
just
cadavers.
quite difficult.
Fresh cadavers. And we actually were putting these fresh cadavers.
So when you say fresh, do you mean like they were unembalmed?
Yeah, because you don't want to change the tissue.
No, because I know that's an issue often with the fascial mechanics.
Yeah, so we were doing all of these weird stretching routines in these people that had recently passed away, unfortunately, and it was the most bizarre experience I think I've had as a researcher.
Yeah.
Because we were doing different tests that you guys use as physiotherapists.
Straight leg
raise, and we had strain gauges on
different parts
the fascia.
Yeah. The findings of that study, I think, just blew my mind. Of going, we are so limited in thinking about force transmission distribution through the myofascial system. Because I remember the thing that I remember from the study is you're looking at straight leg raise and having force transducers in like the back, the hand, posterior thigh, Achilles tendon, plantar fascia, and the forces of the Achilles tendon were the same as the posterior thigh.
That's it. Yeah,
it's like. Okay, that changes your idea of what biomechanics are within the human system, the biological system.
I think one of the researchers described it as a giant sock. So if you pull on one part of the sock, then the
tension goes through the whole sock. Yeah,
it goes through the entire system.
Well, I know to emphasise that point, I know a sports doctor who Paul Coburn I used to work with, and when he worked at Richmond. When they used to do compartment pressure testing in the players, they put the needle in, show a pressure, and they go, and the sports doc said to Coates, look at this, and he'd say to the player, bring your arm over your head, bring his arm over his head, and the compartment pressure would go up.
It's the same, obviously the same concept.
So you go, it really is all connected.
Yeah, exactly, and I mean that was probably one of the most interesting parts of that study in terms of the outcomes. But in terms of the ACL model, it is informed by, obviously, the heel model components in terms of the active and passive components and all of that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, if you're talking about tendon mechanics, you're putting in single values into those models that are representative. So the other thing that the models don't take into consideration are, for example, the cross-sectional area of the tissue. So we have the ACL model is the morphology of the ACL is the same across all of the participants.
Which varies from person to person.
It does, and I mean we really need to get to the point where we're doing full body scans and looking at all of those individual components. And some people are starting to do that now. And I'm loosely affiliated with one of those projects, and so again, it comes back to the individual. So rather than just talking about group differences, it's you need to control for the variations within individual to individual. So when we say we can measure ACL forces, we can measure them, but there are limitations with that. And it's like anything, but I think it is a big step away from just looking at external joint moments. So everyone talks about external joint moments, and some of the research that we've done, it shows that external joint moments are not a great predictor of internal load sharing,
and that makes sense though.
Well, but do you know of I can't think of his first name, but his surname's Huijing, Huyjing, the Dutch researcher who've done a lot of research of looking at force transmission through a muscle tendon unit and how that changes based on tension within other muscles within the compartment or even adjacent compartments. So because again of all the tension within the fascial network and how that influences force distribution. So again, it just starts to add all these layers of complexity.
And some of those things you can measure now, some of those things you just cannot measure. So it does have lots of limitations, but I think the research and the sort of the methods that we're developing are moving forward. So moving away from just looking at external joint moments and starting to think really about, I think you mentioned it before, Jack, about looking at shear forces and contact forces in the tibiofemoral joint and also on the patellofemoral joint, And we've also looked at Achilles tendon force using a fairly gross model, and looking at the shifting balance between the loads in the Achilles tendon, for example, and the patellofemoral joint. So with the footwear research, for example, if you elevate the heel, obviously you're going to increase the loads on the patellofemoral joint, but decrease the loads on the Achilles tendon.
Well, this is the argument that I keep having with, I would say, I'm going to be controversial, but say the fuckwits who think that making wholesale changes to someone's running mechanics by doing something like shortening strides and doing, increasing your cadence, you're shifting load somewhere, whether they're cumulative or in one instance.
Exactly, John. Yeah,
you're not solving the problem you think you're solving.
No, that's
and it drives me nuts as a track coach who sees things through a coaching lens a lot of the times. I get really pissed off with that kind of research because it's garbage in my mind. And it's very naive.
I think at the end of the day it is naive to just think about one structure and ignore the resultant effects on other structures. And footwear is probably a classic example. You're gonna rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, in terms of some of these rather aggressive design features.
Oh yeah. We're seeing heaps. It's changing now because people are getting used to them, but particularly when the development of these sort of super shoes came through. The number of
the
Nike ones, and now there's sort of obviously lots of brands have all done the same thing. The amount of injuries that we saw develop because of that was enormous.
What sort of injuries were you seeing?
Well, they're extremely aggressive on the foot, calf, ankle complex. Like a lot of tendon problems. A lot of bone stress related injuries. It was quite interesting to see that, and particularly the ones who seemed to be the most affected by it were younger people or people with undeveloped sort of like strength profiles and things like that.
Like training history.
They didn't have the bandwidth to deal with that actual acute change in what the forces were being distributed through.
That's really interesting.
It seems to have settled now.
Are they still popular? I don't even
They're
know
extremely popular.
that much about them.
Basically now it's almost ubiquitous that if you go watch, say, the Melbourne Marathon, anyone who's half decent is trying to do, they're wearing $400 super shoes.
Yeah, right. I thought they're banned on a competition level, aren't they, some of them?
And most of them fit within the criteria now. There were a few that did get banned, but it keeps changing. The World Body for Athletics keeps updating the list of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. The big conversations we're having at a clinical level with people is often that these are performance shoes. You wear them for the major event. You do not train in them for your long, slow run where performance is not the major, or like ultimate speed is not the major driver of what you're doing. Like you're going out for a 2 hour long run. You don't need to be in the super fast shoes. You can be in a much more, a much more relaxed kind of structured shoe.
I should know more about that area than I do, but our focus has really been on those court-based sports in terms of multi-directional sort of stuff.
We won't blame you, mate.
Thanks, John.
It's funny, I haven't really thought about it, but that's really an area that probably there's not a lot of information out in the general population for just parents buying their kids shoes just to play weekend sport. And the actual implications all the kids want them though,
because they don't want to be left behind, and the performance.
Isn't like the most in vogue shoes, you mean, or the performance shoes?
Like I'll give you an example. It's really interesting to me as a track coach. There's been an explosion of performances, particularly in juniors. Right, so we keep seeing all of these records being broken, and some of them are old records. And in my mind, I always put a question mark next to them and an asterisk and say, are these performances being driven by improved performance practices, training, knowledge, or are they being improved by the technology of the shoes? Because particularly in people who don't have the physical features to create what they create, which is an increased elastic function, how much advantage does something like that give you? And I've noticed, and we've spoken about this, I think, before, there's certain people who get a lot out of the shoes and certain people who don't get anything out of the shoes.
Exactly.
And the reason is because for the people that get a lot out of it, it's giving something that they don't actually naturally have.
And whether that's tuning their lower limb to the ideal frequency of the surface,
or just keeping that ankle stiffness,
whereas there are people who they're actually are so well developed in those, and like I'll give you an example. there seems to have been in sprints, right, in the events that I coach.
Yep.
There's been a much bigger, I think, average shift in the cohort of elites in females than there has in males.
Okay.
Right?
That's interesting.
And the reason I think that's the case is males naturally are better at creating limb stiffness properties than females.
They definitely are.
No, well, the research supports that, but even just as a coach, it's obvious.
You see it?
You know, you get males to do plyometric tasks, and you get females, the performance is extensively better generally. But we see that even in performance outcomes, and that's another argument around difference between males and females. But I think the reason that the women are getting more out of it is because they actually can get more advantage from having that feature less developed. Whereas the males who are really well developed in those features, it's sort of, it doesn't have that cumulative effect. Or not null, it's probably a little bit, but it's not as much.
No, I totally agree.
Anyway, there's probably one last thing that I was going to ask you, because we've been on nearly an hour and a half.
You're kidding?
Yeah.
Feels like half an hour.
And I've been asking a lot of people this, but as a curious person, as an interested person, what are some of the sort of things that you're trying to tackle that are sort of hiding in the, as I said, the recesses of your mind that every now and then you sort of bring back up that you're interested in, you would love to see sort of either yourself gain more knowledge in or us as a general sort of field understand better?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I mean, I guess it comes back to a lot of the research that we've done. As I was sort of saying at the outset, I'm really disappointed I haven't pursued those hormonal...
You're not done yet, yeah?
No, not done yet, but, you know, I didn't really strike while the iron was hot, so to speak, but looking at the effects of hormonal status on soft tissue mechanics and that kind of thing. But one of the areas that I think would be great to look more into is really around, you know, joint health across the lifespan. You know, we've looked at ACL, you know, we've looked at changes in loading patterns in terms of underloading, because typically we find in ACLR patients, they underload, they don't overload, and that underloading is driving the pathology. So changes in cartilage volume and composition, bone marrow lesions and all of that kind of things.
That seems to be an area that's really
under research.
Big question mark still.
It is, and I mean, when we finished our first study, which was called Young People with Old Knees, we had a big cohort, and it's still, in terms of computational modelling, we looked at walking, running and sidestepping, and we found underloading in all of those domains, and we found a relationship with structure, with cartilage structure.
Can I ask you, because that's something that Jack and I have asked a lot of people and no one seems to have a good answer, is do you think that we will get to the point where understanding cartilage function in joints will get to a point where we think we can in some way rehabilitate that?
Again, really good question. I mean, there's some really good mathematical models that are emerging, so finite element modelling around cartilage. How far that's developed, I'm not too sure. Again, you probably need to talk more to a cartilage modelling person, a cartilage expert. I'm certainly, you know, we've published papers in that space, but I wouldn't call myself a so-called
one thing, and maybe,
expert.
and hopefully you can steal this and do the research for us, is Jack and I have spoken a lot about the concept that one of the main features, as we spoke about before, is you need to get the mechanical loading right, but you also need to get the nutritional environment right. And one of the things that is heavily missing from all of our diets is the ingestion of type 2 collagen. We don't eat type 2 collagen really at all, right? But that's the main constituent of articular cartilage.
That's exactly right,
So I haven't seen this research, but I think it would be cool to see if, similar to tendon, if you actually gave supplementation or a lot of food that was type 2 cartilage and paired that with the right mechanical kind of stimulus, would you actually see regenerative changes to the articular surface?
I'm just going to add to that, because I think there's actually a third element.
Yeah, well, you said the metabolic.
Better to say, because the thing that's really clear with the connective tissue system is the impact of your metabolic health or function with regulating collagen. So,
well, I think Adam's cohort is a good one, because, as I said, it's young people with old knees. I think they're the cohort almost to study in it, because they're not unhealthy in that metabolic sense.
And that's probably where you need to differentiate someone who develops OA because of prior trauma versus as perhaps as a measure, as a impact of metabolic syndrome. Because you look at things like OA, you see that there's so many systemic factors and metabolic syndromes associated with it. Not to mention, if you look at things like metabolic dysfunction associated with tendinopathy.
Pathology.
Yeah. And then the other really interesting one too is we recently talked about this in the clinic of this more research coming out now of looking at things like blood flow restriction for adaptation of tendon tissue.
Okay.
And that the metabolic stress is a really large signal for tendon remodeling.
Okay.
And that, like, much more than muscle, because, you know, with a lot of the blood flow restriction literature in muscle, it seems that it can elicit an effect, but it's not that different to doing, say, moderate intensity with no blood flow restriction. But for tendon, it seems to be much more responsive to metabolic stress.
So there's papers that are published on blood flow restriction and tendon.
Yeah, I can share them with you.
You should have a look at them, they're fantastic.
Oh, yeah, I'd really, because Gavin Williams, who works at the Epworth, he's an expert in
acquired brain injury stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, neuro. And he's using blood flow restriction in his patients.
We're using it a lot for a lot of injuries.
But it's good he's using it in those neurological cohorts.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, Jacob.
No, that's all right. No, it makes a lot of sense too because of also just thinking about the lack of mitosis that can occur within connective tissue structures, particularly within cartilage, where you've got the chondrocyte, and if it's gone, it's gone. But they're so sensitive to your metabolic capacity or metabolic function. So if you've got type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, which basically the majority of the population does, your chondrocyte becomes senescent, so it can't regulate the extracellular matrix. So I think that comes to your point then too of you actually need
Adam's
the building.
The person to do this for you.
Yeah, you actually need the building blocks.
He's got the cohort.
That's phenomenal.
To build the cartilage, but you also need to make sure that the chondrocytes are active and that they're able then to be able to regulate the extracellular matrix.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I wasn't aware of the tendon work with blood flow restriction on tendon. That's phenomenal.
Maybe
I'd like to read that stuff, but I can't think of what I was going to say. Oh, with the ACLR cohorts, what we did some rudimentary cytokine analyses.
I remember you telling me about this.
Yeah, some of them were, and we only looked at systemic cytokines. I think it was interleukin-6 that we looked at from memory.
It always comes up IL-6.
Yeah. And that's the culprit.
So what we found was at 2 years, and don't quote me on this because it's not published, but
it's been recorded.
Yeah, I'm recorded here, so
we're quoting you.
Put my foot in it, haven't I? So at 4 years at 2 years they were 4 times higher. So this is systemic inflammation. And then at 4 years they were 2 times higher.
That's such interesting information.
So it comes back, I guess, to what you were saying about metabolic health. In terms of if you rupture your anterior cruciate ligament and then someone cuts a tendon and takes a third of that tendon and drills some holes through your tibia and your femur, what is the long-term effect on systemic inflammation?
Yeah,
and
it's significant. That's what it is.
And what effect does that have on every other joint and structure in your entire body? So I think thinking more holistically, like you guys are advocating, I think is a fantastic way to move forward. So I've picked up a lot from this conversation. We'll have to have you guys out for a think tank.
We really appreciate your time, Adam.
No, it's
we're
my pleasure.
definitely going to ask you to come back on.
Wow.
Not only are you a very good colleague to have, you're also a good friend to have. So thank you very much, Adam.
Thanks, John.
Appreciate your time.
Cheers, Adam.
Appreciate it.